All right. For today's study group, there isn't a topic in particular, but as usual, if any questions come up, just feel free to interrupt me. There are a few things I wanted to talk about. The first thing being that today, the curriculum team has made an announcement on one of our requirements for graduation has changed in a good way. So previously, we talked about blogs being a graduation requirement where you had to write 7 blogs. It has actually changed starting with this, starting this week, that we only need 4 blogs for graduation. So about half of the blogs that we needed at the start. And how that works is typically, well, not typically, but basically with every phase project, you will submit a blog. So the first one's coming up at the end of this phase. And you have the choice of writing your blog about your project. So very commonly people just talk about what it was like during their project, things that they noticed, or maybe something interesting that came up, or it can be anything data science related. And that is the case for each of your projects. So that's a new requirement. I will post that in writing on the Slack channel as well after this. But does anyone have any questions on that? Cool. We just have 3 fewer blogs to write for the program, which is a little less stress. That's always good. All right. Let's see. So that was the one announcement that I had. The next thing we're going to talk about is I had a Git question, and also I'm going to talk about pair programming. Pair programming, we actually have like a little slideshow that Flatiron uses, so I'm going to go through that. But before that, we're going to talk about Git. I know that there are a lot of little Git things here and there that we've encountered. And one really good question I got was, what is the difference between Git Pull and Git Fetch? So you saw me do Git Pull, I think probably a couple days ago when I was like making changes on the study group repo and I had to pull some changes down. But as you can see in your study group, in your study group instructions, you're doing a Git Fetch. Technically, or if you think about the direction of how data is moving, Git Fetch and Git Pull are very similar. Both are taking changes from remote to your local. In this case, you're fetching from upstream. And if we remember for study group, let's see, I'm gonna like set up my terminal and then show you all what I mean by that. Let's see. All right, let me change my share really quick so we can see my terminal window as well. Cool. So here's my terminal. Let's clear everything. Command K to clear on a Mac. I'm not too sure what the command is for Windows, but all right, if we take a look at the remotes, git remote -v for any repo, you have origin here, and by default is the origin. Let me actually go to a different one and see if I can find an example with an upstream. I think it's a test, and let's take a look at, see this one. So cool. This is an example. So here, if you remember, one of the first things that we did was to add my version as the upstream, just so that you have my version and your version that are different remotes. And when you're git fetching from upstream, you would git fetch from my version. By default, git fetch will do it from the origin, which is this. In this case, this would mean your version. This would mean my version. I know I don't have like a good exact example, but hopefully that clears things up between origin and upstream. But difference between fetch and pull, git pull is actually equivalent to doing both git fetch and git merge. So what git fetch is doing, it is fetching the data, but it isn't making changes to your local repo yet. It's sort of like an intermediate step. So you would kind of get your changes, your repository will notice that there are changes. If you were to do git status, it would recognize that there are changes to be made, to be pulled. but those changes aren't actually made on your files until you do the git merge step. Now, Git Pull just combines the two steps together. When to use which? Typically, if you're just working on your very own repository, like if you're working on a solo project, which we will do at some point in this course, if you're working on solo projects, you're pretty sure that you're not getting changes from anywhere else. You can straight up just do a Git Pull. But in the case that when you're working on like a paired project and maybe you're not sure, or maybe your partner also forgets what they had done Git push on, if you do a Git Fetch first, you can actually take a look and see what commits were made before doing that Git merge. This is something I just looked up, Git Pull versus Git Fetch. I think the main ones here are Git Pull downloads the latest changes. Doesn't make it bigger? No. Downloads the latest changes and automatically merges the changes. Whereas Git Fetch just pulls down the code it pulls down the code but doesn't do that merge. So you can see here, it retrieves the changes without merging them. And so Git Pull is similar to Git Fetch followed by Git merge. So the direction of data flow is the same, but with Git Fetch is sort of like, you're sort of safeguarding yourself from like accidentally merging something that you don't want. Does that make sense? Cool. Does anyone else have any Git questions? Awesome. We're gonna move on to talk about pair programming now. Let's see. So I'm just gonna go through this slide deck. Just so y'all know, this slide deck is used for both software engineering and data science. Pair programming is actually a practice that started with software engineering, but has started to make its way into data science, just so y'all know. So let me just get this presenter view because I like to see all the stuff, and let me reshare just this window. Awesome. Where did those speaker notes go? All right. To talk about pair programming, I think pair programming is something that's going to be very beneficial, and it's going to take a little bit of getting used to, especially because this is an online program. After this presentation, I'm going to talk about some good ideas and opportunities you can practice your pair programming, especially to prepare for the project, because the first project will be a paired project. All right, so why do we pair program? It makes learning easier, divides the workload, and always good to have your code reviewed immediately. You are less likely to get stuck on random little problems. You know, how many times have you been like stuck on a problem and then you have someone else look at it as like, oh, that little thing, that's something that pair program actually stops. Through pair programming, you actually learn a lot of new methods because different people code in different ways. I think we've seen a bunch of examples where, like, for example, with that Macbeth lab, right? There's so many different ways that we can create a dictionary and increment counts. There are also different ways to do a bunch of things, like with for loops and while loops. There's a lot of code that is kind of interchangeable, and everyone develops their own style, everyone develops their own syntactic sugar, but it's always good to be aware of all these other styles of coding, just so you know, you get used to being able to interpret other people's code. Because a lot of what data science is repurposing code that already exists. This is a good practice to just see how other people code. All right, so traditionally, what is pair programming? Pair programming has two roles. You have a driver and a navigator. What's important to know here is that the point of pair programming is not to solve the problem as quickly as possible. I mean, you can make that one of your goals as well, but that's not the main idea of pair programming. Here, it's kind of twofold. One, you want to be able to write better code and solve a problem more elegantly because you have to talk out what it is you're doing. And two, you kind of learn better that way. You know, sometimes I know a huge problem or a huge blocker that people face with pair programming. A very common thing that I hear from students, like, I don't want to hold my partner back. And if you're in the opposite role, there is a huge benefit to explaining something to someone else. And so if you feel like, you know, I'm on the slower side and I don't want to like, hold someone back or like take up more of their time than is needed, you're actually doing them a benefit as well by getting them to explain things to you. I mean, I feel like I know a lot of what I know because of my role as an instructor. So yeah, later in a little bit, I'm actually going to bring up the Pomodoro technique. Has anyone heard of the Pomodoro technique? Kinda. All right. So the Pomodoro technique is basically a timer that there's a Pomodoro timer, but the technique is basically you're switching off roles. For data science, it's a little bit different because in software engineering, you're very often just like working on like an entire app. And maybe you're working on chunks of the app, but very much you're writing big chunks of code at once. For data science, a little bit different. The coding is much more in discrete parts. Like you can see as we define functions, the functions don't affect each other unless you want them to. And so it works a little bit differently for Python, but basically it's the idea of switching your roles every, usually it's 20 minutes, but depending on the problem, you might want to subdivide your time differently. And so we have these two roles of a driver and navigator. What does the driver do? The driver drives. The driver is the person who is actually typing the code. The navigator is the one that's sort of like thinking out loud or like dictating what to code. And it like, I think what's very important to remember is that you don't, as a navigator, there is no pressure to always say the right thing. As a navigator, thinking out loud is a really good practice. And if you get that wrong, as the driver, you're also not just blindly typing, but you're also kind of like looking at what you're doing critically. And there's a lot of opportunity for discussion and mutual learning in that sense. Has anyone ever heard of the term rubber ducking? It's kind of a funny term, but the term rubber ducking actually came up from, again, software engineers. But the idea of rubber ducking is if you run into a problem, try explaining what you've done to a rubber duck or an inanimate object. And what they found is that through trying to break something down to as like low level and as granular as possible, you really learn what it is that you're doing. And you just figure out, I think like in breaking down code that you're writing, you sort of see where you might have gone wrong, or you kind of find out where your error lies. And so this idea of rubber ducking, of course, for our purposes, is a lot more helpful when you're trying to explain it to someone else because that person can respond. But the idea of like really breaking down what it is you're doing is such an important skill. I think as a data scientist as well, one of the most important things you can take away from this course, aside from Googling, is being able to explain what you're doing to a non-technical person. A lot of data scientist roles are kind of that connection between people who do pure technical analysis and the business side. Because being a data scientist, you have to take into context or take into account the business, the company, and whatever it is that you're researching on and whatever it is that you're doing your data science work on. And so you have to be able to communicate that part. And in a lot of technical interviews, what they do test on is your ability to break down really technical concepts to a non-technical person. And these are things that I'm actually gonna be asking you during our later one-on-ones, as well as our project reviews. But any questions about this driver navigator role? Awesome. Now, there are some things to discuss before you start. This slide deck is also used for campus programs, so being mindful of other people's personal space, very important. If you ever, I think some of you are in like similar cities. I've actually had students in the online program meet up in person and like work on stuff together. That's been really fun to see. But yeah, be mindful of each other's personal space. Sometimes you don't really think about that when you're trying to like complete a project or, write code. Whose computer will you use? For us, being online, most likely it would be the driver's computer. And then usually for what it is, depending on where we're coding, when we switch roles, all it is like a Git push just to get the other person's code. Or even easier, before we get to that, if we're not super comfortable with Git yet, literally just Slack each other your code. I think that's also a really easy way of sharing code. But we hopefully will get used to using Git more and more later. When do you switch roles? So that definitely depends on, the size of the problem that you're trying to solve. Maybe you're working on a huge project that is allocated about 10 hours. You're going to split that up and maybe like rotate every 20 minutes. Usually the idea is not to be in one role for more than 20 minutes, just so there's a bit of a balance. What is the goal of this session? Again, this is going to be really useful for bigger projects. I personally am really into goal setting. And so when we get to the projects, you'll see that every day I'll set like intermediate goals of like where's a good place to be in your project to be on track. And for mini sessions of coding, there's a good idea to like break that down even more and say that, all right, by the end of the session, let's finish analyzing this set of data. Again, not super relevant to us. Always ask permission before you touch another person's laptop. I am very guilty of this. If any of you ever end up meeting up, just be aware. All right. Cool. How to make the most out of pairing. I think it's very important to, again, remember, which is why I've been saying this so much, that it is a learning opportunity. We are not like writing code to be pushed out into production for some like great app right now. This is a learning opportunity. We're in a boot camp. We're all here to learn. So use this as an opportunity to practice your learning, your communication, things like that. Ask a lot of questions. Questions just always help clarify. There is no question too simple. So just ask questions. And always keep in mind that questions benefit both sides. One, you get clarification. And on the other hand, being the person answering the question, you kind of solidify your knowledge. And it's very important to keep that in mind too. Be very precise in your words. When you're trying to ask a question, especially try to use technical terminology. So for example, like with the Lambda, saying like, I'm not too sure what this X in the Lambda is referring to, or why is this X even there? Rather than like, what is that thing in that line? Just getting into the habit of saying these technical words, it does make a difference. And this one, I feel like I have to clarify technical terminology when you're asking a question, non-technical in your answer. And that's like a good practice for both parties. And not knowing is never a problem. Does anyone know who this guy is? No? That's Ryan Lochte, I think. US Olympic swimmer, Ryan Lochte. Got in trouble for doing some silly things. But anyways, I digress. All right, communication and feedback. This might sound very elementary, but is surprisingly important and good to keep in mind. Inevitably, you might end up with like conflicts and like disagreements, which is why it's important to keep these rules in mind. I remember the first time I saw this, I'm like, I'm not a child. I don't need to be told when to use I statements versus we statements, but this is surprisingly helpful. In communication, always say we instead of I. It just kind of like brings that idea of a team back together. Always use positive language. I think a very harmful thing is like, you're not doing this right. This is not the way that you are supposed to be doing it. I think just changing that pronoun from a you to we makes all the difference. Constructive feedback. I think as much as possible, if something's not working, I like to frame constructive feedback as like, all right, frame the issue and then add a suggestion. Or frame the issue, but also not just like point out what's wrong, but point out like more specifically what's going on. It's hard to say without concrete examples, but if you see that maybe someone's using a single equal sign instead of a double equal sign, they'll be like, that's wrong. Instead be like, all right, we should be using a double equal sign because if we remember, double equal sign is for checking for equivalency, single equal sign for assignment. Just like being more constructive and positive in the way that you do your feedback, it's going to be much more helpful. Impact versus intent. I understand that sometimes we get frustrated and you say things and you don't mean it, but I think it's a good idea to keep in mind that, we're all human. I get hurt by words sometimes too. So impact versus intent on both ends, really. One, being very aware of the things you're saying and how it can affect other people, as well as, you know, if you're on the receiving end, try and put yourself in the other's shoes. Did they mean it to intentionally hurt you? I know it's like kind of a hard practice to do, but it's all about keeping positivity as much as possible. And also reflect. At the end of pair programming session, I usually like to be like high fives, virtual high fives. But also I think it's always good to like reflect on what were some things that went well during this pair programming session. I remember my very first pair programming session is actually when one of my classmates taught me how to use a Lambda. I was very, very confused about like, actually I was confused about map versus filter for some reason. And I had my pair programming partner really break that down and explain that to me. And that was super helpful. I really appreciated the way he did that. So I just let him know, I really like the way you broke this question down. And I actually heard that after that first pair programming session, that person ended up explaining things similarly to other students. So just hearing good feedback perpetuates good, I guess, practices. Similarly, if there are things that didn't go as well, again, keep in mind, like, you know, the constructive feedback stuff. Questions so far? Cool. The mindset matters. One of Flatiron School's slogans is students for life. We actually have a bunch of t-shirts made that say that. But yeah, being a student for life is kind of what Flatiron School is about. Be patient as well. You can ask questions, but also recognize that your partner is putting in the time and effort to provide you with the information. So it's always, I think, like, the way that I kind of mitigate conflict as much as possible is by putting myself in the other person's shoes. It is kind of a balance for sure. But yeah. Staying on task and finish the problem. I know I mentioned that the idea is not to plow through the code as quickly as possible, but there are goals that are set. What do we want to achieve during this session? The ideal is to get those goals completed. And yeah, it's okay if you're a beginner. I think that's something that I've pretty much said in every slide. All right, let's see, what else? Finally, take breaks. I think this is something that is very, very important, something that I didn't really do at the beginning of my bootcamp experience, and I definitely burnt out by like phase 3. But on a smaller scale, remember to switch roles every 20 minutes. I think it's been shown like experimentally that anything past 20 minutes, there's a little bit of fatigue from both ends. I guess, you know, navigator gets tired of not being the one typing. Driver just gets like too into, I don't know, being the driver. I'm not too sure, but experimentally it's shown that 20 minutes is a good amount of time. So utilize the Pomodoro methodology. There's actually online Pomodoro timers that will go off every 20 minutes as a reminder to switch roles. And yeah, remember to get up and walk around every once in a while. Take virtual breaks as well. Carpal tunnel is a thing. I actually do have carpal tunnel a little bit. And so I actually spend a lot of my mornings stretching my wrists because I type all day. So just be careful of that. Yeah, and that's just from like being in a position typing, and sometimes if like your desk is not the right height, it makes it worse, stuff like that. But yeah, I think that's all, because this next slide is about hygiene and self-care, which unless you guys meet in person, not super relevant. But it's kind of surprising that we have to mention this, because these issues have come up before. But yeah, any overall questions about paired programming? Cool. I think something that's, oh yeah.
When are we gonna start our pair programming?
Yeah, I'm actually like right after this going to mention some opportunities where you can decide to pair program. Actually, yeah, I'll start with that right now. I think a good place to start with pair programming would be every morning when starting Monday, I'm going to be sending out like a practice Python problem every morning. And of course, as we move to different topics, these exercises will change. So actually next week, it'll be a mixture of Python and Pandas problems, which I think if you want, you can practice pair programming with people in your working group. Also, in topics 4 and 5, so let me go into topic 4 and 5 and take a look at what's here. So this is topic 4. There's actually a mini project here. I know like one person working on this by themselves will take about 2 hours to complete. So I think this is a really good opportunity to pair program, save some time. There's a very similar project also in here in topic 5. So these topics are both next week topics. Next week, every day, I'll be sending out a question. These are all really, really good opportunities to pair program. I know I don't know about you guys, but might be a little bit awkward the first time, especially over Zoom and you all not meeting each other ever. But I really, really recommend that you try it out. It's going to be really good practice. So when you get to the project, things will go more smoothly. And just to let you all know, for this first phase, I'm just going to be randomly pairing you all up within your working groups for the project, if that's helpful to know. Might have to do a little bit of shuffling, maybe, but we'll see when we get to end of week 3. So those are good opportunities to practice pair programming. What I was about to say is that pair programming is surprisingly something that interviewers will ask during a cultural interview. Like, what is your experience pair programming? What is some of the feedback that you've gotten from pair programming? Because I think pair programming just shows like qualities of being a team player, qualities of being open to feedback and acting on feedback. So it's really important to get used to that practice.